In a previous presentation, we briefly discussed the question, why should we care about moral philosophy, about ethics? In this short presentation, I want to address a more focused question. Why should Christians care about moral philosophy? And I am a Christian, so I'm speaking from that point of view. We remember that moral philosophy involves questions such as what makes life meaningful? Why are some societies stable and others unstable? What kind of person do I want to be? And as Plato says, these are questions of tremendous importance. And in that presentation, I mentioned three philosophers whose work has had a great impact on me: Aristotle, Epictetus, and John Keats. But if the Bible itself contains moral philosophy, if the Bible itself contains information about how we should lead our lives and how we should make moral decisions, for example, in the book of Proverbs, why should we bother with non-Christian thinkers? And this is an ancient question. Tertullian, the church father, asked the question this way: what has Jerusalem to do with Athens? Athens is that Greek city associated with Aristotle, with Plato, with Socrates. What does the church have to do with Plato's academy? And Tertullian's answer is, it doesn't. He didn't think that there needed to be any interest in Greek philosophy. We had all of the truth that we need within the walls of the church, within Scripture. St. Paul himself, in the book of Colossians, tells us to avoid hollow and deceptive philosophy. And so we take these things and we might conclude, well, there's no need to bother then with non-Christian philosophy. But on the other hand, we see Paul in Athens, that very city associated with Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. We see St. Paul there talking with Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Now, we can't take time right now to discuss what the Epicureans believed, what the Stoics believed, but we see that Paul is there in Athens talking with them, and he's not only debating with them. It's clear in Acts chapter 17 that he knows what their writers have written. He's familiar with their philosophy. So, for example, discussing God or making a statement about God, Paul says, for in him, in God, we live and move and have our being. And as I've indicated in the notes here, that's a thought very much associated with an ancient non-Christian philosopher. And then Paul himself says that now he's quoting a Stoic philosopher when he says that we are God's offspring. And what Paul is doing is indicating to his crowd that he's aware of their teaching, he knows their philosophical system. So clearly Paul has studied Stoic and Epicurean philosophy. So when he says, be aware of philosophy, beware of philosophy, be aware of what you're learning, he can't be taken to mean avoid it altogether, because he himself did not do that, and he himself used his knowledge of philosophy in his discussions with non-Christians. I think we have another example from Scripture where philosophical ideas from non-Christian sources are used in Scripture. And we have this phrase from the book of John, chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the Word. Now that word comes from the Greek word logos, or logos. Our word logic comes from this word. Also, psychology, anthropology, that L-O-G bit at the end of those words comes from logos, and it's a very difficult word to pin down. Among the Greeks, this word might point to the reason of God. It might point to the thought of God stamped on the universe. It might refer to the source of people's ability to reason. These are interpretations that come from the New Testament commentator William Barclay, as he actually spends several pages discussing this term, logos. It's not an easy term to pin down. It's difficult to know exactly what John means. The simple point being that in that very first verse there in the book of John, we have a Greek word that has philosophical connotations, that when a person who knows these philosophical connotations reads that in the Gospel of John, that he knows that a philosophical statement is being made. In the beginning was the logic of everything. In the beginning was the rational order of everything. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos. So clearly John knew of this philosophical idea. Another way that the study of non-Christian philosophy has been useful to me appears here when we look at this verse in Philippians. It's a beautiful verse where Paul says, whatsoever is true, whatsoever is honorable, whatsoever is right, whatsoever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. And I've heard that verse since I was very young. But I never really knew what Paul meant by excellence. Or in a different translation, the word might be virtue. In classical Greek, the word excellence and the word virtue can mean the same thing. But after I spent time reading and thinking about the works of Aristotle, the ethics of Aristotle, and Aristotle spends a lot of time talking about excellence and what excellence is. Excellence is activity, but it's also a state of the soul. Excellence is activity in some endeavor in life, but it's also moral excellence. And for Aristotle, you can't be an excellent person unless you are morally excellent. It doesn't matter how good you are at some particular task. The sort of excellence that he promotes is moral excellence. In any case, the simple point is that my reading of Aristotle's ethics, and as I said, Aristotle spends a lot of time discussing this term excellence, has significantly deepened my understanding of what Paul probably meant when he used this term. If there's any excellence, this is something that's worth paying attention to. This is something that's worth dwelling on. Now, Paul doesn't tell us what he means here. And so we have to do a little work to figure out what exactly is he getting at. And I think in this case, Aristotle has helped me. Now, St. Augustin, a great intellectual and leader in the church, early in the church, wrote that a person who is a good and a true Christian should realize that truth belongs to the Lord wherever it is found. And often in Christian universities we hear the phrase, all truth is God's truth, and this idea comes from Augustine, from this book on Christian teaching, sometimes called On Christian Doctrine. Now, this idea is an idea that Augustine expresses, but often what happens is folks who say that line, all truth is God's truth, they often don't know it's from Augustine, and then they often also don't know that Augustine goes on to spend a lot of time saying that, look, all truth is God's truth, but not everything is worth knowing. We should be careful. So he gives the example of the ancient Hebrews plundering Egypt before they flee Egypt. And he says the Hebrews took from the ancient Egyptians, gold and silver objects that the Egyptians used to worship false gods. And the Hebrews were able to use these things that they took from Egypt and to put them to better use. And Augustine says this is what we Christians can do in the world. We can study things from non-Christians, we can learn from non-Christians, and we can take those things we learn from them, and what we learn from them can help to expand our vision. These things can help us to broaden our knowledge. So, for example, I just gave you the example of Aristotle's writing on excellence has significantly deepened my sense of what Paul means when he says, look, we should dwell on things that are excellent. We should consider things that are excellent. That's an example of what Augustine encourages us to do, to borrow things from the world that are useful. But he also warns us to be careful, that all truth is the Lord's, but not everything is worth knowing. This mind that I have is the only mind I'll ever have. The soul that I have is the only soul that I'll ever have. I should be careful with these things. I shouldn't justify looking at anything because I tell myself, well, all truth is the Lord's. I should be careful. And so Augustine encourages us to be careful while also remembering that truth is the Lord's. So on the one hand, we honor the Lord by seeking truth wherever it is found. And at the same time, we honor the Lord by guarding our minds and guarding our souls and not deceiving ourselves by looking at things that are bad for us, by paying attention to things that are destructive, and then justifying it by saying, all truth is the Lord's. We want to be careful. Now, as an example, I've indicated that I have found Aristotle's work to be very useful, but Aristotle wrote things that, just should be rejected. So, while I appreciate much that Aristotle wrote, other things I reject. And so, as St. James says, we have to test the spirits, right? What's worthwhile and what's not. And so, for example, when it comes to population policy, Aristotle suggests that, you've got a fixed limit of children that families should be able to have, and if a couple has more children than that, then abortion should be practiced. Well, I think even most people in the United States who think that abortion should be legal, they would be opposed to forced abortion. They would be opposed to the government requiring women to have abortions. And the fact is that from the beginning, the Christian view on abortion has been opposition. And so this is a case where, although I respect Aristotle, I reject this idea. And so the thing is, on the one hand, we keep in mind what Paul says. Be careful. Don't get sucked in by vain philosophy. Be careful. But at the same time, we see that he was aware of philosophy, that he was able to talk with Epicureans and Stoics. He was able to quote to the Epicureans and Stoics some of their writers' own thinking. And so both of these things are true. We want to learn what we can to draw in to our minds, draw into our communities useful things, even if they don't come from Christian sources. But we also want to be careful. And we want to remember that it's in our interest as people, as Christians, to focus on things that are true, focus on things that are honorable, things that are right, things that are pure, things that are lovely, things that are of good repute, things that are excellent and worthy of praise. It's hard to imagine that a life lived with these kinds of interests in mind is one that would, at least to some extent, not be fulfilling. A life spent thinking about these things, that's a life well spent. Okay, well, with that point, I'll say goodbye. Take care.